Next, I'd like to introduce the day's first keynote speaker. Director Gil Herrera serves as the Director of Research at the National Security Agency. The Research Directorate develops new and innovative techniques and technologies to enable the signals intelligence and cybersecurity missions of the NSA and Central Security Service, as well as joint authority missions of the intelligence community and the Department of Defense. In 2020, Dr. Herrera was also appointed to the U.S. National Quantum Initiative Advisory Committee, which advises the nation's highest offices on matters concerning quantum information science. Please join me in welcoming Director Herrera.
Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to see so many people here. I thought you'd all be out looking for Taylor Swift tickets. I was, anyway. So I'm honored to talk about a subject that is so rarely discussed, namely the future, as I'm sure no one in the audience has really given much attention to it. Now, when Brett suggested modern conflict in the future of research, I actually did resonate with it because it was sufficiently ambiguous to where I thought I could find maybe a theme that was a little bit different that you don't hear everywhere. And so as a result, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about AI, ML, or quantum, or other emerging technologies. Rather, I'll save time to take questions about those. But this talk is going to be more of a policy talk about the conduct of research in the context of modern conflict. And quite frankly, Chancellor, your talk was a good setup for some of the comments I'm going to make relative to policy. I'll start with a brief history of research and how the relationship between research and conflict, both kinetic and non-kinetic, has evolved over time. To make more time for questions, I will not say the 500 pages I wrote on the part from Aristotle to Edison, and we'll really focus on the more modern area where research really started to engage in support of conflict, which is relatively recent. So during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, research began to wield influence in military and economic conflict. Large corporations began to fund scientific research at universities and began using the results of research in their products and manufacturing. New industries emerged from research laboratories, for example, from Edison and Alexander Graham Bell. And the very first true industrial research lab was founded by General Electric in 1900. Andrew Carnegie founded the Carnegie Institute for Science in 1902 as the first of many foundations that funded academic and other research. The US government started also, they created the US Naval Observatory, the National Bureau of Standards, and the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics before World War I. The impact of scientific research on conflict was less, in the context of military conflict, was less so than it was economic conflict. Industry started to leverage these advances, and the military tended to rely on industry for platforms. A good example of that is the Maxim machine gun, which was developed by an American who moved to England and who sold to everybody in the world. But the US government did fund research on some of the larger platforms like battleships and artillery. And while the US government did fund research, it was relatively modest, focused, and highly applied. But then World War I happened, which really focused the importance of scientific research to conflict. The airplane, tank, truck, submarine, radio, machine gun, and chemical munitions demonstrated the impact of scientific research and innovation. As a result, during the interwar period, the US government began to increase research funding to universities and to research contracts with industry. One result, which led to the very agency I now work for, was the recognition that modern communication technologies meant that we had to step up our game in cryptography and cryptanalysis, and that led to the creation of the Cipher Bureau in 1919, which is a predecessor of the National Security Agency. Naval Research Laboratory was founded in 1923, Bell Labs in 1925, and aviation research rapidly expanded. The interwar period also saw just a deluge of innovation for how we live, electrification, refrigeration, automobile, so on and so forth. Scientific research led to new industries and enabled the US to have the largest economy. The military increased investments in research, although it still predominantly relied on contractors for military systems, examples being the B-17 and B-29, both of which were ordered prior to the outbreak of World War II. Fundamental research still remained the providence of the universities and the foundations, but this period was particularly productive for research, with great leap forwards in infectious disease, the general theory of relativity, quantum mechanics, and nuclear physics. All four would have a major impact on the next major conflict. The impact of scientific research on World War II on both sides cannot be understated, both in terms of the battlefield advantage gained by the rapid transition of research results into combat systems, and in how the war changed the relationship between science and government. This change happened for all combatant nations, but for the rest of the talk, I'll focus only on the United States. For brevity, let me mention a few of the key research transitions that were tremendously impactful on the battlefield without going into details. Penicillin, the proximity fuse, radar, electromechanical encryption and cryptanalysis, analog computers, rocketry, and of course, nuclear weapons, where I've spent most of my career. Instead, I'll focus on how World War II shaped the scientific research enterprise that helped the US win the Cold War and set the stage for the internet and globalization. The person that had the greatest impact on the relationship between research and the US government was not Robert Oppenheimer, who's by far the most famous scientist. It was Vannevar Bush, as mentioned earlier this morning. Prior to the outbreak of war in Europe, Bush was the president of the Carnegie Institute for Science, chair of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the inventor of the analog computer that did all the ballistic calculations for World War II artillery, and most importantly, he was a trusted science advisor to President Roosevelt. Recognizing the need for better coordination between the military and scientists with the outbreak of war in Europe, Bush proposed the creation of a National Defense Research Committee, which was created by executive order in 1940 by the president. But the president also soon felt a need to have an agency directly responsible for research, and a year later, he created the Office of Scientific Research and Development in the summer of 1941. This new agency was given almost unlimited access to funds and resources. Bush became its director, and he reported directly to the president. Among the early actions were the establishment of the radar lab at MIT, the creation of the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, which was where the proximity fuse was invented, and the launching of the Manhattan Project. Bush was featured on the cover of Time magazine on April 3, 1944, with the following caption: Vannevar Bush, General of Science. Then with the subcaption, science, in this war, science is G5. Now, for those of you who are younger, the general staff used to stop at logistics at G4. I know it's gone beyond that. So this was an implication that science was equal, to the adjutant, to intelligence, operations, and logistics in the context of fighting the war. Scientific research was essential to our victory in World War II, and Vannevar Bush was the individual most responsible for establishing the systems, structures, and institutions that turned research into military capability. Now, after the war, Bush faded from the spotlight largely due to his relationship with President Roosevelt, not translating to President Truman. That said, there was a final report that President Roosevelt asked for in November of 1944 that wasn't completed until after his death in July of 1945. That is arguably the most influential policy document of the 20th century and set the stage for the major expansion of research during the Cold War. That report, called Science, the Endless Frontier, created a vision for how to sustain government funding for research after the war, both in the context of defense research, but also expanding it to include medical and fundamental general research in support of the nation. Now, as a result, direct result of the report was the creation of the Office of Naval Research and subsequently research organizations for the Army and Air Force when it was formed, the National Science Foundation, which was his biggest innovation, and an increase in funding for the National Institutes of Health. The influx of federal funding for research enabled the growth of scientific and engineering programs at U.S. universities and the expansion of the science and engineering workforce needed for post-war prosperity and the national security needs of the Cold War. This also enabled the U.S. to take the leadership, scientific leadership, away from Europe. A number of other factors also led to the expansion of research in the Cold War. In addition to the Endless Frontier report, the GI Bill was a major factor that led to the expansion in the number and sizes of U.S. universities. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 created an even greater sense of urgency, leading to the creation of ARPA, now DARPA, and also replacing the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics with NASA, with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. NASA's Apollo program, initiated in response to a challenge by President Kennedy, inspired many students, including myself, to enter into science and engineering fields. The nexus of new students, universities, and research funding during the Cold War made the U.S. research university system by far the strongest in the world. The increased complexity of research in the post-World War II era required larger research teams and significant increases in the cost and complexity of laboratory equipment. This led to the creation of academic research centers by the National Science Foundations, Department of Energy, National Institutes of Health, and the DoD, and also the creation of the National Laboratory System. And again, that's where I spent most of my career before coming to NSA. The Cold War and post-World War II globalization also significantly impacted how research was conducted. There was a rapid increase in the number of global research journals and conferences. I already mentioned the expansion in the quality of the U.S. university systems, and this expansion in quality attracted the best foreign students across the globe. It was particularly true for students applying from developing nations because they didn't have many universities. And upon completion of their studies, most would apply for U.S. citizenship and obtain positions at U.S. corporations and in academia. This immigrant workforce has significantly contributed to defense research in the U.S. economy and the success of innovation hubs like Silicon Valley in Boston and in Austin. Industry also expanded scientific research during the Cold War. Although Bell Labs and IBM research existed before the war, they expanded their work and other organizations emerged, for example, Xerox Palo Alto Research Complex. While the 1980s came and saw the decline of industrial research laboratories that had broad portfolios, due primarily to antitrust enforcements at AT&T and companies losing monopolies in fields such as computing and photography, this period also was the greatest period of increase in federal research spending during the Reagan defense buildup. Federal investments in R&D peaked in 1987 at 1.2% of the GDP, and that was equal to industrial research at the time. Now, 40 years of investment gave us a number of platforms. Nuclear weapons, nuclear submarines, stealth technologies, microelectronics, the internet, a number of great innovations, and something happened. The Cold War ended. Now, a name I thought you were going to mention, Chancellor, was Francis Fukuyama. How many are familiar with his? Okay, so Fukuyama wrote The End of History, and in that, it was a pamphlet, I think, in '89, followed by a book in '91 or '92. He predicted that the spread of liberal democracies would end conflict. And as a result of that, the country demanded a peace dividend. These and other policy changes, along with a significant amount of innovation in information technology, resulted in the next period I'll discuss, the internet and globalization. Post-Cold War policy changes, along with the arrival of the internet as a commercial service, altered both research and the fields of conflict. Let me address a few of the policy changes. First, the amount of federal investment in research fell by 50% from 1987 to 1999, and concurrent with that, there was a shift from defense research to health research, doubling of the NIH budget during the Clinton administration. Hiring at DoD labs came to a standstill. In 2001, I was on the Army Science Board and was on a study that assessed the state of the Department of Defense labs, and the title of that study was Community in Crisis. National labs cut staff. We had retirement incentives and other actions at Sandia where I was working. The defense industrial base went through major consolidation and had layoffs, and the superconducting supercollider was canceled. And while globalization commenced with the end of World War II, it went into hyperdrive during the 1990s with several policy changes, including bringing China into the World Trade Organization and encouraging and enabling the global flow of finance and jobs. Industrial R&D expanded during this period, rising from about 1.25% of GDP in '87 to 1.8% of GDP in 1999. But US companies focused on R&D and design, and simultaneously delegated manufacturing to offshore divisions or contract manufacturers that were also offshore. The number of Silicon Valley and other startups accelerated, with a significant fraction having founders not born in the United States. The offshoring of manufacturing, particularly in microelectronics and electronic assembly, had the result of making US military systems dependent on, in some cases, our adversaries to make our weapons. Globalization has also resulted in US technology companies becoming multinational enterprises with subsidiaries and customers in many countries, again, including adversary countries. But when we express concern about this phenomena, I think we all have to remember that the ascent of strategic competitors was a result of an intentional policy action over 20 years on the part of the US government to encourage, enable, and quite frankly, finance the globalization that led to the state we're in now. Now, while the 21st century brought a restoration of some of the federal research investments, manufacturing offshoring continued. Fortunately, the best foreign students continue to apply to US universities, and just quoting statistics from a few years ago, temporary visa holders earn more than half of US doctoral degrees in economics, computer science, engineering, math, and statistics. And at elite universities, this number is significantly higher, somewhere between 70 and 80%. Now, this is an important thing to note. These foreign students are not replacing US students. They're filling a void left by the lack of students who elect to pursue PhDs in STEM fields. So now let me shift to conflict. In many respects, the internet has changed the battlefield upon which modern conflict is waged. The most obvious change is in cyberspace, where active conflict exists today. We even have a combatant command for cyber, and the commander of it happens to be sitting in the front row, my boss, General Nakasone. And this is the only combatant command that's not tied to a geographic location. And the internet also created new combatants, because not only nation states, but individuals and small groups can cause global disruption without leaving their home countries, or in some cases, their parents' basements. Because the cost of entry to enter into this battlefield is a $1,000 laptop and internet service. It's a very, very modest cost of entry. And most modern technologies either exist or are enabled by large computer platforms that are developed and operated by the private sector, and all rely on offshore manufacturing. This creates an environment where innovative commercial products and digital weapons can be developed quickly and without the need to develop infrastructure or supply chains. Given the global nature of these technologies, They are accessible to anyone or any country in the world as long as one has the talent to exploit the technology and the money to fund the technical development. The internet and globalization have created a virtual defense industrial base for anyone to exploit. An artifact of this change is that the US government does not directly control most modern technologies. The only government control mechanism is regulatory, and regulations lag technology. The delay in creating regulatory structures mean that some potentially harmful technologies, for example, AI, don't have a regulatory structure. They're largely unregulated. And then others, like telecommunications, have out-of-date regulatory structures. Many of the telecommunication regulations were written before the internet. I believe that future research in support of national security programs will be conducted under the following circumstances. US corporations will invest about 4 times more than the US government in R&D. Most corporations are multinational, with productions, operations, and research conducted globally. Research will have a dependency on supply chains and technologies, including from adversary countries. Military technologies that result from this research will have similar dependencies. Well over half of STEM PhDs educated in the US will be foreign nationals, with US students not showing significant interest in pursuing STEM degrees. Universities in China now produce about twice as many STEM PhDs than US universities produce in total. Adversaries are engaged in IP theft, and the internet significantly facilitates such theft. And if we haven't picked up on the theme, AI is going to make that much, much worse. The cost of conducting R&D in the United States is higher than in other countries, as is the cost of manufacturing products resulting from research. Government research is strongly dependent upon commercial platforms, for example, the cloud, which it does not control. So what does all of this mean for modern conflict and the future of research? In order to retain the commercial and military advantage that the United States has held for over a century, that has been based on a resilient, agile, and open research enterprise, we need to adapt our existing practices and policies related to research, alter investment strategies, improve research infrastructure, increase STEM talent, particularly at the PhD level, and simplify and make more effective federal research governance practices. It means that research will necessarily be conducted on the battlefield, as research is dependent upon the information technologies and networks in cyberspace. The conduct of research must envision and account for the possibility that adversaries will attempt to alter programs, change results, and steal intellectual property. Researchers must change the way we do business by adopting verification and validation techniques, as well as recognize the importance of employing exquisite cybersecurity and physical security practices. Security must be as important as instrument calibration, environmental controls, software validation, peer review, and other best research practices. It means that the US government policies and regulations regarding the conduct of research and the manufacturing, sales, and exports of goods and services resulting from research must be updated and be kept up to date. An obsolete regulatory framework can inhibit US companies from performing research domestically that they can also perform at foreign affiliates. Additionally, overly aggressive export controls can give foreign competitors an advantage over US industry in the global marketplace. It means that we must protect technologies that require protection from the start, for example, nuclear weapons and hypersonics, but also recognize that a free and open fundamental research environment is essential to making progress in other areas that are dual use, for example, synthetic biology and AI/ML. The appropriate point of control for dual-use technologies is where research is conducted in the use of technology for a sensitive application. But it also means that we must embrace and utilize the talent educated in our university system to the greatest extent possible. We must do all we can to encourage the best U.S. students in high school to pursue STEM degrees in college and to obtain graduate degrees. We must find an inspiration for Gen Z that is proportional to the inspiration of my generation, the Apollo program, that will inspire them to enter into STEM fields. But we also must work to encourage foreign graduate students to remain into the U.S. and seek citizenship. I understand that a small number of foreign graduate students are adversary intelligence agents, and we must employ counterintelligence methodologies to find and remove such threats. But we also must recognize we need the foreign talent to succeed. Over 100 foreign national scientists worked on the Manhattan Project, 8 of which either had or got Nobel Prizes. The development of ICBMs and the Apollo program would not have been possible without the German rocket scientists, including its leader, Wernher von Braun. Today, over 20% of all U.S. university professors are foreign-born, with the number likely being over 50% in engineering and computer science. Many of our technology companies are led by people who made the conscious choice to leave their home country in pursuit of education and opportunity, including Google, Microsoft, AMD, and IBM. And when you go layers below the CEO, you'll find proportional layers in key executive ranks. More than half of Silicon Valley startups have foreign-born leadership. If we are to maintain global leadership in research and technology, we must attract and retain the top talent in the world, and this is a model that has served us well for over 80 years. So let me end with a vision for an ideal state for future research that can best help the U.S. succeed in modern conflict. Research will provide the U.S. the means to obtain the greatest technical advantage of emerging technologies and provide the means to protect against the threat posed by these technologies. Research will utilize all instruments and platforms, but do so securely. A proactive regulatory environment exists which protects the public and permits U.S. industry to compete and exploit new technologies. The U.S. government will have effective technology transition strategies to rapidly utilize research results from both U.S. government labs and from industry. American students pursue STEM PhDs in record numbers, inspired by the challenges that their generations face. And the U.S. will continue to attract the best foreign students to attend our exceptional academic institutions where they choose to stay and contribute, taking advantage of the opportunity afforded all citizens in a free and democratic society that is the United States. So thank you for your attention, and now on to questions.
Thank you very much for that interesting talk. And so, of course, for me, as someone who works in history, I enjoyed all of those references to where we were, where we're going, how we got to where we are now. So this is a little bit of a wacky question, and it goes back again to the 17th century, Director. There's something of a little dirty secret in the history of science. The father of chemistry, Robert Boyle, and Isaac Newton, were involved in experiments to find the Philosopher's Stone. And so for me, as I look at where we are right now, and I think someone said we're at a pivotal moment, inflection point. The last panel talked about Wile E. Coyote. I have to wonder what would have happened if they had actually found it. That certainly would have put everything up for grabs, and it would have turned everything we know about life upside down, right? So from the Higgs boson to quantum mechanics and large language models, are we finding our philosopher's stones? And in the end, what would that mean? And what's NSA's sense of things in that regard?
Yeah, and first off, for some reason, I thought Harry Potter found the Philosopher's Stone, but another issue. Listen, I think what that really reflects is, if you look at, in the evolution of science, the amount of knowledge that we had is expanding and our reliance on explanations beyond science is contracting. Another good example is Alfred Wallace, who, with Darwin, came up with the theory of evolution, believed in seances. So there are a lot of examples, given lack of insight, people will embrace other alternative explanations. So I must admit that some of the pitches I've seen in quantum computing do look like they require a little bit of philosopher's stone to make them real. But I think the importance of the scientific method that really has emerged over the last 400 years and has accelerated over maybe the last 80 or 90 years allows us to kind of balance our need to embrace the impossible represented by the search for the philosopher's stone, but also to be founded in the scientific principles that'll help us get there. And it's interesting, with your background, one of the biggest innovations of the last 100 years in research is this notion of falsifiability. And do you know who came up with falsifiability?
No.
It's Popper, right? So a philosopher actually came up with one of the key innovations in the scientific method, this notion that you have to make it falsifiable. So
and I'll jump in on that. What's also interesting is the whole idea of a scientist is a relatively modern term, because at the height of the scientific revolution, actually for centuries before that, scientists were not referred to as that. They were referred to as natural philosophers, right? Because they were engaging not just math, they were engaging philosophy as well.
Yeah, and I actually had that in my talk, but Brett thought it was too long, so I cut that part out. I really did go from Aristotle to Edison.
I know. I read your talk ahead of time. It was fascinating. The historical aspects of it were fascinating. But we had an earlier discussion where you said yesterday, you said that the Higgs boson was a different type of phenomenon than, for example, large language models, because you said that really was using the context of the scientific method, where you start with the theory, right? Talk to me a little bit about what you said yesterday. I found it fascinating.
Okay, great. And I'm also going to use this question as an opportunity to answer that first-time caller question, because I could lead into that with this one. It was really fascinating in the last panel. But with the Higgs boson, and this gets to this notion of falsifiability that I mentioned earlier, we knew that building a $10 billion instrument on the border between Switzerland and France would actually yield the discovery of the Higgs boson, because if it didn't, it would falsify the entirety of the standard model of physics. And so, but people had faith in it and believed it, and indeed, in short order after the modifications to CERN and the Atlas detector, they discovered the Higgs boson. So it was an example of where and you can, innovation was there. The challenge we had with AI ML is we don't have a complete understanding of it, right? And there are emergent properties coming out of large language models that were not anticipated. And I viewed AI ML as something that I thought could not do scientific research up until probably about 6 months ago. And I used to posit a question to my AI ML colleagues that if you fed the Potomac data, the Potomac observations into a large language model, would it come up with epicycles, which was the way that the planetary orbits were determined when people thought the Earth was at the center of the universe? Or would it come up with Newtonian physics? Or would it come up with a general theory of relativity? All three of which describe relatively accuracy, the planetary motion. Because I really thought that AI/ML couldn't do science. But now I'm beginning to wonder, because of these emergent properties that are evolving. But what I wanted to slide into that last discussion, for all the fear you've heard today about AI/ML, I'm not sure that you're scared enough, because there's another recent development that I've seen, that I read in something somebody forwarded me yesterday, is that OpenAI and GPT-4 probably aren't our biggest worries now. It's probably that when Facebook lost or somebody took out Lambda, and people have access to these models. What innovators are doing with these technologies without requiring the need for 10,000 GPUs, a couple $100,000 of training time is shocking, because what we've done is unleashed to innovators the ability to take something that's not understood and poke and prod, and weird things are coming out. They talked about hallucinations. Sometimes hallucinations yield technical advances. I mean, to me, hallucinations are more akin to genetic mutations that we see in evolutionary biology. So yeah, I'm scared too.
That's interesting. Another projection into the future is quantum computing. And what's your sense of when we'll have a useful quantum computer, what challenges would be overcome, and then what that would mean to have the ability to do quantum computing at a large scale?
Yeah, I'm going to answer 1, 3, and 2 in terms of the question. I get asked that all the time, and my answer is usually that I think we'll have a quantum computer sometime between 10 years and never. And I think that's a good air bound. Now, let me get to what it means. So and I gave a long talk on this about 6 months ago, but when you look at the verified applications for quantum computing, they're quite a small list. The verified applications, and the one we're most afraid of, is Shor's algorithm, which would allow the breaking of RSA and elliptic curve cryptography. So, that one, of course, is a killer app, and it's a real killer, right? The other known application is the study of molecular chemistry, and that was the original Feynman, proposal, that in order to study, physics at the molecular scale, you need to actually have a computer at the molecular scale, and that's when he posited a quantum computer. That was the application. There are a lot of other proposed applications. There are some that are known that don't have exponential speed up. They have polynomial speed up, like search algorithms. But we're still searching, and there are a lot of applications for things that only the purest of mathematicians care about, that don't have a real-world application. But it's an active field of research, and one that I hope we find results. Now let me get to the challenges. And I used to be really optimistic about quantum when I first entered the field in 2006. And we funded at Sandia a $18 million 3-year project. And if the goals of that project had been achieved, we would have the highest fidelity qubit in the world today. And you see that, and there's a lot of optimism in the field, and I can easily see why there's that optimism. But over time, I've become more pessimistic, and this is largely due to the fact that I'm not a physicist. I'm an electrical engineer, and most of my career was involved in scaling semiconductors, with Moore's law. And with Moore's law, we had the ability to do a little step that generated revenue, and then companies could turn 20% of revenue into R&D to solve the next problem that emerged in microelectronics. And there were a number of problems that went along the way that I won't bore you with the technical details. But that was a business model, this virtuous cycle that enabled that. And it's amazing what we did, over the now 60 years of microelectronics.
So here's a question, as we look at the complexities of quantum computing, and also all of the work that you're doing in research at the NSA, to the extent that you're able to talk about it, where would you be hoping to see more research by universities like Vanderbilt?
Where I wish, and we're doing this in programs funded by the NSA, what we really need is a fundamental physics-based understanding of how a qubit works. So from my view, the corollary of quantum mechanics in the classical world is Boolean algebra. And what we don't have, that we have in microelectronics, is something called semiconductor device physics. So there does not exist today in quantum a set of theories and principles that allow people to relate like the qubit dimensions and materials properties and presence of electromagnetic fields and all these physical phenomena, to models where you can actually simulate how a device will perform. And so we're in this design, build, test cycle with quantum, and in microelectronics, we simulate and make. And it really cuts the design cycles, and that enabled Moore's law. So device physics and computational simulation are why we could scale microelectronics. In quantum, we don't have the equivalent of that. And so somebody has an idea, they make it and they test it, and then they try something else. And that's really slowing progress in the field. So working on fundamental theory and also on making a better qubit.
I want to make sure we're going to be short on time, so I want to ask two very complicated questions, but very quickly. One is from the audience. Well, both of these are from the audience. How open is NSA to sharing data to academia and industry for AI, ML, RDT&E, and purposes in unclass and even class? Part of an innovation hurdle is that academia and industry have limited access to operational or mission data for test and research, particularly when the classification level gets higher.
Yeah, we do have a lot of data sets we share today. In fact, this afternoon I'll be visiting Xenophon and hear about some of the research that we're funding here in the Science of Security project. But in terms of sharing data, one of the biggest challenges we have is not classification, but it really is compliance with federal laws related to privacy. And so even in my organization and research at NSA, we use a lot of simulated data so we can not have to address the compliance hurdles. But I'd be happy to talk with whoever raised that question to see what we might be able to do to help with sharing some of the data sets we use in unclassified environments.
And another question that really does get to our research mission here at Vanderbilt is you propose very strongly in favor of foreign national PhD students. How do you propose that we encourage PhD students and postdocs to remain in the U.S. and do the great work that they do in our universities while also managing national security and IP theft risks?
Yeah, and those are really important questions. So one proposal, and I got to be cautious because I'm on a couple of FAC advisory boards, and you may or may not read about these in the future, but the whole issue is about risk management, right? In the past, it was relatively easy to get permanent residence, and things kind of changed after 9/11, and then it got a little bit easier, and now it's reversed, and it's really a lot more difficult. But the challenge that the foreign national students face is when they graduate is when the process for permanent residence starts. And if it takes a long time to clear, then they're incentivized to go back to their home countries or other countries. So one option is to allow PhD students and postdocs to start the permanent resident application at the start of their programs rather than at the end. And that would allow the government to clear and identify the people that are foreign agents. And the other advantage of that is, why educate somebody that you know is a foreign agent, but you don't find that out until the end? Do it before they get the PhD. And so to me, that's a prudent thing. That's nothing a university can do that requires federal action, but that's something that I wouldn't be surprised if advisory boards wouldn't recommend sometime in the future.
Well, I really would like to thank you for this wonderful talk, and I'm sure others will have questions for you out in the lobby and more informally. Thank you, Director.
Thank you.